Stay in your place." The words landed flat and cold, like a glass set down too hard on marble, and for a split second the entire private dining room seemed to hold its breath. The low hum of conversation thinned, forks paused mid-air, and even the soft jazz drifting from the corner speaker felt like it had stepped back to listen. Naomi Carter didn't move right away, her hand still steady on the silver tray, the condensation from a row of untouched water glasses cooling her fingertips, a faint ring of moisture forming where one glass had shifted under the subtle nudge of Edward Langford's hand. He didn't look at her again, not fully, just a brief dismissive glance as if confirming she existed only to be ignored, before turning back to the table of men in tailored suits whose watches alone could cover a year of her rent. The overhead lighting reflected off polished wooden crystal, catching the edges of his cufflinks, the sharp crease of his sleeve, the confidence in the way he leaned back like the room belonged to him, like every voice in it bent in his direction. Naomi lowered the tray an inch, careful, controlled, the quiet clink of glass against metal the only sound she allowed herself, and for a moment her eyes flickered, not at him, but past him, to the projection screen glowing at the far end of the room where columns of numbers stretched across a spreadsheet too dense for most to follow at a glance. But her gaze didn't skim, it locked, precise, absorbing, tracing a line item that didn't sit right, a figure that bent the wrong way, a clause hidden in the margins of financial confidence. Around the table, a few men let out small, polite chuckles, the kind that weren't jokes but signals, subtle acknowledgments of hierarchy, of who spoke and who didn't, of who mattered and who served. "We're finalizing this tonight," Edward said, his voice smooth, assured, the kind of tone that didn't invite questions so much as end them before they formed, and a pen rolled between his fingers, tapping once against the edge of a leather folder. Naomi stepped back half a pace, just enough to disappear from the immediate frame, exactly where she was expected to be, invisible but present, silent but necessary, and yet something held her there, not defiance, not hesitation, something quieter, heavier, like a thought that refused to be ignored. The air felt cooler near the walls, the scent of expensive cologne mixing with the faint citrus polish of the table, and somewhere behind her a door eased open and shut, a whisper of movement that no one at the table acknowledged. Edward continued speaking, outlining returns, projections, confidence wrapped in numbers that sounded clean, controlled, inevitable, and one by one heads nodded, agreement moving through the room like a current. Naomi's grip tightened just slightly on the tray, not enough to rattle the glasses, just enough for her to feel the weight of it, the balance, the way everything could tip if one thing shifted wrong. Her eyes lifted again, drawn back to the screen, to that same line, that same imbalance, and this time she didn't look away as quickly. A man at the far end adjusted his tie, another leaned forward to sign, and the quiet rhythm of pens meeting paper began to form, soft, deliberate, final. Naomi inhaled slowly, the kind of breath you take when you're about to step into something you can't step back from, and though no one invited her voice, though every signal in the room told her to stay exactly where she was, she felt the words rise anyway, steady, certain, impossible to ignore, and just as the first signature neared the page, her voice, calm, clear, unmistakably present, cut through the polished silence. The word did not come out loud at first, it hovered somewhere between her breath and the edge of decision, but the room felt it before it fully formed, a subtle shift, like pressure changing before a storm, and Naomi Carter stepped forward just enough for her voice to exist inside the circle they had drawn without her. "Sir," she said, calm, not raised, not apologetic, just present, and the pen in Edward Langford's hand paused a fraction above the paper, not because he had been stopped, but because something unfamiliar had interrupted the rhythm he controlled so easily. A few heads turned, slow at first, then sharper, eyes narrowing not in curiosity but in disbelief. Because voices like hers were not supposed to enter conversations like this, not here, not now. Naomi felt the weight of every gaze without looking directly at any of them, her posture straight but unforced, the tray still balanced in her left hand as if she had not stepped outside her role at all, and yet everything about the moment said she had. The numbers, she continued, each word placed carefully, as if setting something fragile down in the middle of a crowded table, they do not align with the liability projection on the final page. Silence did not fall all at once, it fractured, one conversation cutting off, then another, until the only sound left was the faint hum of the projector and the distant clink of glassware from another room down the hall. Edward finally looked at her fully, not past her, not through her, but at her, and there was no recognition in his eyes, only irritation sharpened by disbelief, the kind that came from being interrupted by someone he had already decided did not matter. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quieter now, controlled, but edged with something colder, something that did not need volume to command attention, and a few men at the table shifted in their seats, not uncomfortable, but alert, sensing the shift in tone. Naomi did not step back. Her fingers adjusted slightly under the tray, redistributing the weight, grounding herself in something physical as her mind held steady on the detail that had pulled her forward in the first place. "If you follow the margin note tied to the compliance clause," she said, her eyes flicking once toward the screen, then back to a neutral point just past Edward's shoulder, "it redirects the post-signature risk entirely to your side. It is subtle, but it is there." A soft scoff came from somewhere to the right, quickly followed by a low chuckle, then another, the sound spreading unevenly, not because it was funny, but because it was expected, because it restored the order that had just been disturbed. "She reads spreadsheets now," someone muttered under his breath, not quite quiet enough, and a few more smiles appeared, thin and dismissive. Edward let out a short breath through his nose. Something between a laugh and a sigh, and set his pen down deliberately, the small click against the table louder than it should have been. "You are here to serve water," he said, each word measured, not raised, but unmistakably final, not to analyze deals you do not understand. The words hung in the air, heavier than before, not because they were louder, but because they were meant to close the moment, to return everything to its proper place. Naomi felt the heat rise faintly along her neck, not from embarrassment, but from the awareness of how easily this could end right here, how simple it would be to step back, to disappear again into the quiet system that kept rooms like this running without ever being seen. For a fraction of a second, the room waited, not for her response, but for her compliance. But her eyes moved once more, drawn back to that same line, that same quiet imbalance that had refused to let her walk away, and when she spoke again, her voice did not change, it did not rise, it did not challenge, it simply continued, steady and certain, as if the truth itself did not require permission to exist. The air did not snap, it stretched, thin and fragile, as if one more word might tear it completely, and Naomi Carter did not rush to fill it, she let it hold, let the weight of what she had already said settle into the polished wooden glass around her, into the quiet calculations happening behind eyes that were no longer entirely dismissive. Edward Langford leaned back slightly in his chair, not retreating, not conceding, but reassessing, his fingers resting on the table now instead of the pen, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed by the others who had built their instincts around reading men like him. "Then explain it," he said finally, the irritation still there but tempered by something sharper, something more deliberate, because if he was going to dismiss her, he would do it with certainty, not assumption. Naomi nodded once, small, controlled, and shifted the tray to the edge of a nearby service stand, freeing her hands without breaking the quiet composure she had maintained from the start, and for the first time she stepped closer to the table, not into it, but near enough that the screen's glow reflected faintly in her eyes. "The compliance clause references a conditional adjustment," she said, her voice steady, each word placed with care, "but the wording in subsection C redirects accountability after execution, not before. It reads like a safeguard, but it functions like a transfer." A man near the center frowned, leaning forward slightly, his attention no longer on Edward but on the screen, and another reached for a copy of the document, flipping pages with a growing sense of urgency that he tried, unsuccessfully, to keep subtle. The earlier smiles had faded, replaced by something quieter, more cautious, the kind of attention that comes when confidence begins to question itself. Edward's gaze flicked toward the screen, then back to Naomi, measuring, calculating, and for a brief second there was something almost imperceptible in his expression, not doubt exactly, but the absence of certainty. "Page," he asked, a single word, clipped, controlled. Naomi did not hesitate. 17, she replied, her tone unchanged, as if she had been holding that number in place from the moment she first saw it. The man with the document found the page, his thumb stopping mid-motion, and the silence that followed was different now, no longer dismissive, no longer casual, but focused, tightening around the table as I scanned lines that had been overlooked minutes ago. "It is embedded in the language," Naomi continued, "not louder, not faster, just clearer, so it does not trigger concern at first read, but the effect is the same. If anything fails after signature, the loss consolidates on your side." The projector's light hummed softly, casting a pale glow across faces that were no longer relaxed, and one executive adjusted his glasses, leaning closer, his lips parting slightly as he traced the text with growing precision. Edward reached for the document in front of him, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a controlled motion that suggested he was still in command of the room, even as the room itself shifted beneath him. He flipped to the page, eyes scanning quickly at first, then slowing, then stopping. And the small muscles along his jaw tightened just enough to register if you were looking for it. No one spoke. No one laughed. The earlier rhythm of agreement had dissolved completely, replaced by a silence that listened, that waited, that recalculated. Naomi stood still, hands relaxed at her sides now, no longer holding the tray, no longer anchored to the role that had defined her presence moments ago, and yet she did not step further in, did not claim space that had not been given, she simply remained where she was, steady, certain, as if the truth itself required nothing more. Edward's finger pressed lightly against a line on the page, then moved back, then forward again, tracing the language with a precision that mirrored her own, and when he finally lifted his eyes, the room felt it before he spoke, that subtle shift when power does not disappear, but changes direction, and for the first time since she had entered, he did not look past her. Edward Langford did not speak right away, and that silence carried more weight than any reaction he could have chosen, his eyes still fixed on the page as if the ink itself had shifted beneath his gaze, as if something he had trusted to remain stable had quietly rewritten itself while no one was looking. Around the table, chairs creaked softly as men leaned forward, no longer performing agreement but searching, verifying, recalculating. Each movement small but deliberate, like a room full of people suddenly aware that the ground beneath them might not be as solid as they assumed. One executive cleared his throat but said nothing, his finger tracing the same line Naomi had pointed out, then moving back, slower this time, his expression tightening not in confusion but in recognition. This changes exposure, he murmured, not to Naomi, not even directly to Edward, but into the space between them, and that was enough to shift the balance further. Edward's jaw flexed once, controlled, contained, and he set the document flat on the table, smoothing it with the palm of his hand as if the act itself could restore order, but the room had already moved past that point. "Who drafted this?" someone asked from the far end. Voice lower now, stripped of earlier confidence, and another replied quietly, naming a firm that carried weight, credibility, a history of precision, which only deepened the unease rather than resolving it. Naomi remained still, her presence no longer an interruption but a fixed point in the room, and though no one had invited her further in, no one asked her to step back either, the invisible line she had crossed now blurred beyond recognition. Edward finally looked up, not sharply, not with irritation, but with a focus that had changed direction, and when his eyes settled on Naomi again, there was no dismissal left in them, only calculation, the kind reserved for something that mattered. "Walk me through it," he said, his voice quieter than before, but clearer, each word deliberate, and the request did not sound like a challenge anymore, it sounded like an admission that he needed what she saw. Naomi nodded once, the movement small, grounded, and stepped closer to the screen, not hesitating now, not asking for space, simply taking it in the only way she knew how, through clarity. "The language is structured to appear conditional," she said, lifting her hand slightly toward the projection without touching it, her finger hovering just below the line, but the trigger is not tied to performance metrics, it is tied to timeline. Once the agreement is executed, the fallback clause activates regardless of fault. A man beside Edward leaned in, his brow furrowed, and whispered something too low to catch, but Edward did not respond, his attention locked on Naomi as if every word she spoke was a piece of something larger he had not yet fully seen. "So you are saying," he said slowly, measuring each syllable, "that if this deal goes through," he did not finish the sentence, but he did not need to. Naomi met the space just beside his gaze, steady, respectful, but unyielding. "Then any failure shifts entirely to you," she said, her voice even, not dramatic, not forceful, just certain. The word settled into the room without echo, without resistance, and for a moment no one moved at all, not because they were frozen, but because they were thinking, each one recalibrating. What the deal meant, what the risk was, what had almost happened. Edward leaned back slowly, the chair absorbing the movement with a soft sound, and he exhaled through his nose, not sharply, not in frustration, but in recognition, the kind that arrives too late to prevent a mistake but just in time to stop it. His hand moved back toward the pen, then stopped halfway, hovering above the table, and this time it did not resume its motion. Instead, he let it rest. The room followed his lead without being told, the quiet now deeper, heavier, no longer the silence of dismissal but the silence of realization, and in the center of it all, Naomi stood without shifting, without claiming anything, her presence defined not by where she stood, but by what she had made impossible to ignore. The silence did not break, it deepened, pressing in from every corner of the room until even the smallest movement felt amplified, and Naomi Carter could feel it settle around her shoulders like a weight that was not hers to carry but had found her anyway. Edward Langford's hand remained still above the table, his pen untouched now, his attention no longer divided, and yet the room did not shift fully in her direction, not yet. Because recognition did not erase hierarchy, it only complicated it. A voice from the far end spoke, measured but edged with unease, "We need legal to review this again," and another followed quickly, "This could delay everything," the words overlapping just enough to reveal tension without losing control. Edward did not respond immediately, his gaze still on the document, then lifting again toward Naomi, and for a brief second something unreadable passed through his expression, something caught between acknowledgment and resistance, as if admitting the truth required more than simply seeing it. "How long have you been standing there?" he asked suddenly, the question not as simple as it sounded, and the room stilled again, attention snapping back toward her, waiting. Naomi did not look away. "Long enough to notice," she replied, her voice quiet, even, offering no more than the truth itself, and a few eyes shifted, not in agreement, not in dismissal, but in reconsideration of who she was in this moment. Edward's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in restraint, and he leaned forward, placing both hands flat against the table as if grounding himself in something solid. "You understand the magnitude of what you are suggesting," he said, his tone controlled, but the weight behind it unmistakable, because this was no longer about a mistake in a document, it was about the implication that he, in this room, in this position, had almost overlooked something that could cost millions, perhaps more. Naomi felt the words settle, felt the expectation behind them, the quiet pressure to retreat, to soften, to frame what she had said as a possibility rather than a certainty, but she did not shift. "I understand the numbers," she answered, not defensive, not confrontational, just clear, and the distinction hung in the air, subtle but undeniable. A man to Edward's right exhaled slowly, leaning back, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, more cautious, and another executive flipped through the pages again, faster now, searching for confirmation, for contradiction, for anything that could restore the balance that had been lost. "If she is right," someone said under their breath, not intending to be heard but heard anyway, "we are exposed the moment this is signed." The words did not echo, but they landed, each syllable reinforcing what was already taking shape in the room. Edward's eyes flicked briefly toward the speaker, then back to Naomi, and for the first time there was no dismissal left at all, only a question that had not yet been spoken, one that carried more weight than any command he had given earlier. But the tension did not resolve, it stretched, held between acknowledgment and consequence, because accepting what she had revealed meant accepting where it had come from, and that was something the room was not yet ready to do. Naomi felt the shift, the hesitation, the unspoken resistance, and she remained exactly where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, her presence steady against the current moving around her. The tray sat untouched behind her now, the glasses still, the condensation forming small rings on the polished surface, silent markers of time passing, and somewhere beyond the closed doors, distant footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway, a reminder that the world outside this room continued unchanged, even as everything inside it began to tilt. Edward drew a slow breath, his shoulders rising just slightly before settling again, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate than before, not to assert control, but to hold onto it. "Who taught you to read contracts like that?" he asked, and the question carried something new, something that had not been there before, not authority, not dismissal, but the beginning of recognition, still restrained, still guarded, but impossible to ignore, and for a moment the room waited, not for him this time, but for her. Naomi Carter did not answer immediately, and in that pause there was no hesitation, only a quiet shift inward, as if the question had reached somewhere deeper than the room expected, somewhere that did not belong to polished tables or tailored suits but to long nights and second chances that no one here had witnessed. The hum of the projector softened into the background, the light from it casting a pale glow along the edge of her cheek. And for a moment she simply breathed, steady, grounded, letting the weight of Edward Langford's question settle without rushing to meet it. "No one," she said finally, her voice calm, unforced, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without rising above it, and a few brows furrowed, not in disbelief, but in the quiet recalibration that comes when an expected answer does not arrive. Edward's gaze remained fixed on her, not impatient, not dismissive, but searching now, as if the answer he had expected had been replaced by something he did not yet understand. Naomi's eyes did not meet his directly, they rested just to the side, steady, respectful, but unwavering. "I used to study it," she continued, each word measured, not offered as explanation, not offered as defense, simply placed where it belonged, before I had to stop. The room did not react all at once, but the shift was there, subtle and spreading, a change in how she was seen, how her presence was processed, not as interruption, not as anomaly, but as something that had always been there, just unnoticed. One of the executives leaned back slowly, his chair making a faint sound against the floor, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in thought, connecting pieces that had not been presented together before. Edward's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, unconscious motion, then stilled, and he glanced briefly at the document again before looking back at her, as if testing the reality of both at once. "And now you are here," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, but something in between, something that acknowledged the distance between what she had been and where she stood now. Naomi nodded once, the movement small, grounded, accepting the fact without elaboration. "Yes, sir," she said, and there was no bitterness in it, no regret placed on display, just truth, simple and complete. The silence that followed was different again, softer, not because the tension had disappeared, but because something within it had shifted from resistance to recognition, from dismissal to consideration. A man near the end of the table closed his folder slowly, the sound deliberate, and another removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if adjusting to a new perspective that required effort. Edward leaned back slightly, his posture no longer projecting control outward, but holding it inward, contained, and for the first time since the meeting began, he did not look like a man managing a room, but like a man reconsidering it. His eyes moved briefly across the table, taking in the faces around him, the uncertainty, the quiet agreement forming without words, and then returned to Naomi, steady, focused. The pen remained untouched beside his hand, the signature that had seemed inevitable now suspended in a space that felt almost distant, as if it belonged to another version of this moment that had already passed. Naomi stood without shifting, her hands relaxed at her sides, the faint outline of where the tray had rested still visible in the slight tension of her fingers, and the light from the overhead fixtures reflected softly along the polished surface behind her, catching the edges of the untouched glasses, small circles of condensation marking time in silence. Edward drew a slow breath, not sharp, not forced, just enough to ground the decision forming beneath it, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something quieter, but far more certain than before, not because he was asserting control, but because he had recognized where it needed to change. Edward Langford's hand finally moved, not toward the pen, but away from it, a small motion that carried more consequence than any signature could have, and he leaned forward slightly, his gaze no longer fixed on the document, but steady on Naomi Carter, as if the axis of the room had shifted and he was choosing to follow it rather than resist it. "We are not signing this tonight," he said, his voice calm, measured, but final. And the words did not echo, they settled, immediate and absolute, rippling through the room in a quiet wave of acknowledgment. A few executives exhaled almost in unison, the tension in their shoulders easing just enough to reveal how tightly it had been held, and one man closed his folder with a soft, deliberate motion, as if sealing off a version of events that no longer applied. Another reached for his phone, likely already considering the calls that would need to be made, the revisions, the questions, the careful untangling of something that had nearly been accepted without question. Edward's attention did not leave Naomi. "We will have legal re-examine every line," he continued, not raising his voice, not needing to, because the authority in it no longer came from assumption, it came from decision, and this time the room followed without hesitation. There were no objections, no interruptions, only a quiet alignment forming around the new direction, as if the gravity of the situation had finally settled into place. Naomi remained still, her posture unchanged, her hands relaxed at her sides, and yet the space around her felt different now, not larger, not louder, but more defined, as if the room had finally adjusted to her presence instead of trying to ignore it. Edward studied her for a moment longer, not in the way he had before, not with dismissal or irritation, but with a focus that carried weight, recognition, and something that bordered on respect, though it had not yet been spoken aloud. "You stopped us from making a very expensive mistake," he said, each word deliberate, not offered lightly, and the acknowledgment hung in the air, shifting the final pieces into place. No one laughed now. No one looked away. The earlier hierarchy, so rigid, so clearly defined, had not disappeared, but it had been altered, bent by something quieter and far more difficult to dismiss. Naomi gave a small nod, nothing more, not claiming the moment, not expanding it, simply accepting the truth of it as it stood. Edward's eyes flicked briefly to the untouched glasses behind her, the faint rings of condensation marking where time had passed unnoticed, then back to her, and for a brief second there was something almost reflective in his expression, as if he were measuring not just what had happened, but what it meant. "What is your name?" he asked, though he could have found it easily, though it was likely printed somewhere in a schedule or a roster. The question carried a different weight when asked directly, when chosen. "Naomi Carter," she replied, her voice steady, and the name seemed to settle into the room alongside everything else, no longer overlooked, no longer background. Edward repeated it once, quietly, as if committing it to memory, then straightened in his chair, the movement subtle but intentional. "Miss Carter," he said, the title placed carefully, deliberately, acknowledging not her role in the room, but her presence within it. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they did not feel small, and for a moment the room held onto them, letting them define the space that had just been transformed. Naomi inclined her head slightly, the gesture respectful, contained, and then her eyes shifted briefly toward the service stand, toward the tray she had set aside, the small, quiet anchor of the role she had stepped beyond, and for a fraction of a second it seemed as though she might return to it, might slip back into the background that had once been expected of her. But she did not move yet. The room was still watching, still recalibrating, and the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was full, shaped by what had just occurred, by what had been revealed, and by the quiet understanding that nothing in this room would feel exactly the same again. Naomi Carter did not rush to respond to the shift in the room, she did not step forward to claim it, and she did not linger to measure it, she simply reached for the tray with the same steady motion she had used before, her fingers finding the cool metal edge, grounding herself again in something familiar, something that did not change even when everything else did. The glasses remained untouched, thin circles of condensation marking where time had passed unnoticed, and she lifted the tray with quiet precision, the faint clink of glass returning as if the room were remembering its original rhythm, though nothing about it felt the same. Edward Langford watched the movement, not as one observes a server completing a task, but as someone noticing detail that had previously gone unseen, and there was a pause in him, a hesitation that had not existed earlier, as if he were deciding whether to let the moment end or to step into it once more. "Miss Carter," he said again, his voice softer now, less formal in tone but more deliberate in intention, and the word stopped her just before she could turn away completely. She glanced back, not fully facing him, just enough to acknowledge, her posture still composed, still respectful, but no longer defined by distance. Edward leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, not gripping it, not asserting anything, just present. "If you had not spoken," he began, then paused, the sentence unfinished, not because he could not complete it, but because the outcome was already clear to everyone in the room, and for a moment he seemed to weigh whether to say more, whether to explain, to justify, or to simply accept. Naomi did not fill the silence for him. She waited, still, grounded, allowing the moment to remain what it was. Edward exhaled quietly, then continued, "That would have cost us more than money, and though the words were simple, they carried something deeper, something that reached beyond numbers, beyond contracts, into the space where decisions define more than outcomes." Around the table, a few heads lowered slightly, not in shame, not in embarrassment, but in quiet agreement, in recognition of how close they had come to something they had not seen. Naomi gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth without expanding on it, without taking more space than she needed, and for a brief second her eyes moved toward the screen again, as if confirming that the line she had noticed was still there, still real, still as quiet and dangerous as it had been moments before. Edward followed her glance, then looked back at her, and this time when he spoke, there was no hesitation at all. "You should not be carrying trays in a room like this," he said, the statement not dismissive, not corrective, but reflective, as if he were recognizing something that had been misplaced rather than misunderstood. The words hung in the air, and the room absorbed them carefully, not reacting immediately, not rushing to interpret, because they carried implication, possibility, and something that had not yet fully formed. Naomi's expression did not change, but something in her stillness shifted, almost imperceptible, like a breath held just a fraction longer than before. "This is where I am right now," she replied, her voice even, grounded, not rejecting his words, but not accepting their direction either, simply stating the truth as it stood. Edward considered that, his gaze steady, and for a moment the room felt suspended again, not in tension, but in transition, as if something new had been introduced and had not yet settled into place. A man near the end of the table cleared his throat quietly, another adjusted his notes, small movements returning as the meeting began to reassemble itself around a different center. Naomi turned slightly then, the tray balanced once more in her hands, and began to step away, not hurried, not hesitant, just moving forward with the same quiet control she had carried into the room, leaving behind a space that no longer looked the same without her in it, and though no one called her back, no one stopped her, every eye followed her movement for just a second longer than necessary, as if the room itself were reluctant to let the moment fully close. The door closed behind Naomi Carter with a soft, controlled click, the kind of sound that barely registered but marked a clear boundary between what had just happened and everything that would follow, and the hallway beyond the private dining room felt cooler, quieter, the air no longer thick with tension but still carrying the echo of it in her chest. She walked at a steady pace, not fast, not slow, the tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, the faint reflection of overhead lights sliding across the glass as she moved, each step measured, grounded, as if nothing in her rhythm had changed, even though everything inside the room had. Behind her, the meeting resumed, but not in the same way, voices lower, more deliberate, papers shifting with a different kind of care, and at the head of the table Edward Langford remained still for a moment longer than the others, his gaze resting on the closed door as if it held something he had not fully grasped yet. The document lay open in front of him, the page unchanged, the words exactly as they had been, but the meaning now impossible to ignore, and he reached for the pen once more. Not to sign, but to draw a single line across the margin, a quiet mark of interruption, of correction, of something stopped in time. One of the executives spoke, asking about next steps, about revisions, about legal review, but Edward did not answer immediately, his attention still caught somewhere between the page and the memory of a voice that had not belonged in that room and yet had defined it more clearly than any of them. Naomi turned a corner, the sound of her shoes soft against the polished floor, and the distant hum of the restaurant returned gradually, the quiet clatter of dishes, the low murmur of conversation, the familiar rhythm of a world that did not pause for moments like the one she had just left behind. She moved past a row of windows, the city lights stretching out beyond the glass, reflections layered over reflections, and for a brief second she saw herself there, framed in motion, carrying the same tray, wearing the same uniform, unchanged on the surface, and yet something in her eyes held a steadiness that had not been there before, not louder, not brighter, just clearer. Back in the room, Edward finally set the pen down again, this time with intention, and closed the folder in front of him, the soft sound drawing the attention of everyone at the table. "We start over," he said, his voice even, but carrying a weight that did not invite disagreement, and though no one mentioned her name, no one needed to. The shift in direction spoke for itself, a quiet acknowledgment of where the turning point had come from. Naomi reached the service station and placed the tray down, the glasses settling with a faint, familiar sound, and she took a breath, not deep, not dramatic, just enough to mark the moment, to let it pass through her without holding onto it, because that was not why she had spoken, not for recognition, not for change, but because something had been wrong and she had seen it, and that had been enough. A coworker glanced at her briefly, then back to their task, unaware of what had just unfolded beyond the closed doors, and Naomi offered a small, absent smile, returning to the quiet rhythm of her work, adjusting a stack of napkins, aligning silverware with the same care she had always used, her hand steady,